Okay, this is Human Population Dynamics. We are on video 4. This is slides 67 through 86, I believe. So developing countries. China and India are the two biggest developing countries right now. China's the biggest by far, but it's taken some pretty drastic steps for population control, which we've talked about already. India is predicted to move past China and become the biggest developing country by 2050. And Pakistan will be following right behind that. Russia, on the other hand, is losing 600,000 people every year because there's a lot of pollution, hyperinflation. Their economy and their government is not good, very corrupt. There's a high crime rate, high disease rate, and it sounds kind of dramatic, but people are not, just the despair thing, they're not happy and they're not positive. They don't like living in Russia, so they're not positive about their life at this point in time. India has tried to control its population. It hasn't really done a very good job, but China has actually done a really good job. Starting in 1970, we watched that on the video. It was very mixed reactions at first, but it's become fairly successful over time. So if you look at the two countries, I can move this out of the way. So China is in yellow and India is in green. If you look at them, between the two of them, almost half of the world population. Definitely population expanding over time. But the other statistics is what becomes more and more interesting. Even though there's so many people, the literacy is still very high. A lot of young people. Fertility rate has gone down dramatically, so that's really good. But still a very high infant mortality rate, a relatively low life expectancy, and the money is just not there. The people living at $2 or below $2 per day is pretty impressive. Okay, so India had a tough time with their family planning because it wasn't very well planned in the first place. The people in charge of it didn't do a good job. They were very inefficient. But on top of that, extreme poverty. We saw in the video already that women have a very low status. So without the consent and the cooperation, the big thing here is the consent and the cooperation of women and men. Between women and men is a big deal, and without that, where women and men are considered equal, and where both women and men consider the other gender equal, is really the problem here. So until we can erase that mental, that thought process in men in India that women are just not as good as them, we're going to have a problem with the family planning, because the family planning has to be with the consent of both the man and the woman, and with both of their active participation. There's not a lot of financial support for the plan, and the government officials couldn't decide how best to slow the population growth. So there wasn't, there's kind of a lot of stuff going on, and not really a clear plan emerging. China, on the other hand, has done very well. Currently, they're at 1.6 children per woman. And you saw in that video from Monday and Tuesday, they moved up Friday and Monday, 300 million people out of poverty, which is pretty incredible. They're doing much, much better. So you see the strong male preference. Still, that's one of the big problems. You see the population age is increasing, now fewer young people, so you have a smaller workforce coming into the future. And then definitely resources. Resources are a huge, huge issue in China right now. That's one of the biggest things. Okay, so developed countries usually don't have such big problems with population because it's based on poverty. And developed countries, by definition, have a lower, not that they don't have any poverty, but they have a lower level of poverty, so therefore less of a problem with population problems. Okay, this goes back to the out of your textbook, the demographic transition model, talking about that here. As you become more economically developed, birth and death rates tend to decline. So you see this trend that happens as a country goes from developing to developed, where you have this pre-industrial stage, very high infant mortality, not a lot of growth, slow growth, but not a lot of growth. And then the transitional stage where you everything drops, industry begins, and birth rates stay high, so you have an increasing population. The industrial stage, the birth rate drops and approaches the death rate, so it kind of balances out and stabilizes. This is kind of what you're looking for. So you see the graph here where you have the pre-industrial, where your slow growth, you see a positive trend here, but it's not very much. And then your transitional, where your birth rate's staying high, your death rate's dropping. So the population is still increasing, but it's going all over the place. And then your industrial stage is where you're much more so evening out and stretching and flattening out. And then your post-industrial stage, where you see this nice S-curve, kind of where you're really stable as much as you would be. This transition can be difficult in a lot of countries, depending on where they are and what's going on with their economy and their culture at the time. Talked about this already. Birth rates decline as industry increases. So again, it goes back to increased education, increased resources, women working outside the home, all of that stuff tends to drop birth rate. And this goes to pre-industrial stage. You've got a lot of people living in poverty. They don't have a lot of resources. Living conditions are hard. There's a lot of disease. There's a lot of trauma. You have to have a high birth rate because you have a high death rate. So there's not really a lot of population growth because you're losing a lot, especially infants are not surviving. The transitional, you start this industrialization, so food is better, healthcare is better, overall quality of living increases. So the death rates drop, but the birth rates remain high because the people haven't quite adjusted to that yet. So you have a rapid increase in population. Continue with the industrial. It starts to stabilize and balance out all in the industrial stage because of once you have this better quality of life, that leads to more education. Okay, so once you have this more education, you have better access to birth control, you use it more, infant mortality rate drops because disease drops, hygiene is better, women are working outside the home, and then it costs a lot to raise a child. The birth rate declines even further after the industrial stage and the post-industrial stage, and everything kind of balances out. That's where you're going for now. You can even see in the post-industrial that the population would start to decrease once the birth rate falls below the death rate. About 37 countries have reached the post-industrial stage, mostly in Western Europe. The challenge to most population experts, because essentially we do want the population to decline, not dramatically, but we do want to decline or at least to stabilize, is we want the rest of the world to get to this stage. Specifically for the U.S., we've talked about the baby boom already. That's that bulge in our pyramid after World War II. In addition to that, our population sees a lot more women than men in the older age groups because women tend to live longer than men. We have a high percentage of retired people because we have a long life expectancy, so that's where the whole Social Security crisis has come in now. We right now are considered a slow growth population. So the equation, and we've talked about this a little bit when we did those activities, but if you look at this equation, we've got the population, the number of people, times the affluence, how wealthy are these people, times the technology. and the units aren't really there for either of these. It's more like a relative term, or depends on how you decide to measure it. But the whole environmental impact of a person is based on all three things. And when you think about it as a whole, it makes a lot of sense. Number of people is a straight number, but the more wealthy, the more stuff they have. The bigger the house, the more lights they turn on, the more food they consume, the more costly food, the more plastics they use, all that stuff. And the same for technology. The more cars they have, the more phones they have, computers, tablets, all of that stuff leans in toward the environmental impact of that person. Okay, and I think that is actually it. Oh no, I want a couple more slides. Okay, let's keep going. So developed countries, high rates of resource use, that results in a lot of pollution and a lot of environmental degradation per person. So we have a high environmental, I'll go back, sorry. We have a high environmental impact per person, looking at that formula from the last slide. And again, that's the key factor. U.S. citizen consumes about 35 times as much as the average citizen of India and 100 times as much as the average person in the world's poorest countries. So our environmental impact is huge on a relative scale. To do a comparison to make that a little more understandable, hopefully, to you guys, that would mean that a developing country like India would have to have 200 kids per parent to have the same impact as 2 U.S. children. Okay, and that is where we are.